March 15th, 1951. Tehran. The Iranian parliament is erupting in cheers. History books will tell you this was a nationalist revolution, a brave stand against colonial tyranny. And that's partially true, but here's what they won't tell you. This wasn't just about dignity. This was about a ledger. Britain didn't lose Iran because of some democratic awakening. Britain lost Iran because the British Empire was bankrupt. They were drowning in debt, gasping for dollars, and the only asset keeping them afloat was Iranian oil. This is the story of how a nation, on the edge of insolvency, tried to steal another nation's wealth to pay its bills. And in doing so, they created a wound that bleeds to this day. Let's rewind. Let's go back to when Britain looked invincible. Picture London in 1945. The war is over. Churchill stands on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. Crowds fill the streets. Union Jacks wave in the breeze. Victory in Europe. Victory in Asia. The British Empire still spans a quarter of the globe. From India to Africa to the Middle East, the sun never sets on British soil. You can almost taste the triumph. But if you walked into the Treasury building on Great George Street that same week, you would have seen a very different picture. You would have seen men in gray suits staring at red numbers. The war had been won, but the bank account was empty. Britain had emerged from World War II victorious but destitute. The national debt had exploded to over £3 billion, most of it owed to the United States. The factories were bombed. The workforce was exhausted. Rationing was stricter in 1947 than it had been during the war. Bread was rationed for the first time ever. The British people were eating whale meat and powdered eggs. They wore utility clothing because fabric was scarce. The empire was a facade. Behind the pomp and the parades, Britain was technically insolvent, and the only thing preventing total economic collapse was a series of overseas assets that generated hard currency. The crown jewel of those assets was a sprawling industrial complex, sitting on a mud flat in southern Iran. It was called the Abadan refinery. Abadan was not just a refinery. It was the largest oil refinery on the planet. It covered a square mile of blistering desert. It processed 25 million tons of crude oil every year. And every single drop of that oil, every penny of profit that flowed through those steel pipes, belonged to a company called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. To the British government, Abadan was a life support machine. The company generated millions of pounds in revenue annually. It fueled the Royal Navy. It powered the factories of the Midlands. It paid dividends directly into the British Treasury. Without that oil money, the British economy would flatline. The welfare state would collapse. The pound would collapse. The empire would collapse. So when the Iranians stood up in 1951 and said, "This oil belongs to us," Britain didn't hear a political argument. They heard a foreclosure notice. Let's talk about the addiction. Britain's economy in the post-war years was addicted to Iranian oil. It wasn't just about energy. It was about balance of payments. Britain needed dollars to buy food from America, to buy steel, to buy everything it couldn't produce anymore. And the only way to earn those dollars was to sell oil. Iranian oil. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was a strange beast. It was technically a private corporation, but the British government owned 51% of the shares. It was a state within a state. The company had its own security forces, its own housing compounds, its own legal system. In Abadan, the British managers lived in a segregated enclave that looked like a suburb of Surrey. They had cricket pitches, manicured lawns, swimming pools, and air-conditioned bungalows. They drank gin and tonics on verandas while Iranian workers lived in shanty towns made of flattened oil drums just outside the fence. The injustice was mathematical. In 1950 alone, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company made a profit of £170 million. They paid the Iranian government less than £16 million in royalties. Let that sink in. The British government collected more in taxes from the company than the Iranian government received for its own natural resource. The Iranians had no access to the company's financial records. They had no say in the pricing. They were treated as tenants on their own land. For decades, they had simmered. But by 1951, the pressure cooker exploded. The man who ignited the revolution was Mohammad Mossadegh. He was an elderly aristocrat, a lawyer, a passionate nationalist. He wore pajamas to diplomatic meetings. He fainted during speeches. The British diplomats mocked him. They called him hysterical, erratic, unstable. They underestimated him completely. Mossadegh understood something the British had forgotten. He understood that dignity is a currency. He argued a simple point. The oil under Iranian soil belonged to the Iranian people. It was a gift from God to the nation, not a dividend for shareholders in London. He demanded a fair split of the profits, 50-50, the same deal American oil companies had just signed with Saudi Arabia. The British refused. Sir William Fraser, the chairman of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, was a man of the old imperial school. He believed the Iranians were incapable of running the industry. He believed any concession would signal weakness. He treated the Iranian government like a rebellious servant. He refused to negotiate. He refused to open the books. March 5, 10th, 1951. The Iranian parliament voted unanimously to nationalize the oil industry. A few weeks later, they elected Mossadegh as prime minister. The news hit London like a seismic shock. It was unthinkable. A third world nation had simply seized the greatest asset of the British crown. It wasn't just theft. It was humiliation. It was a signal to the world that the British lion was toothless. In the cabinet room at 10 Downing Street, the Labour government of Clement Attlee was paralyzed. They were terrified. They knew what this meant financially. If they lost the oil revenue, the pound would collapse. Living standards would crash to third world levels. They would not be able to afford to import food. The military chiefs drew up invasion plans. They called it Operation Buccaneer. They planned to seize the island of Abadan by force, using paratroopers and Marines. They wanted to do what empires had always done, send in the gunboats. But the Treasury officials looked at the plan and shook their heads. They told the Prime Minister the brutal truth. We cannot afford a war. An invasion would cost millions. It would require occupying a country the size of Western Europe. And most importantly, the United States wouldn't support it. President Harry Truman was bogged down in Korea. He didn't want another conflict. He warned the British that if they invaded Iran, he would not back them up. Without American money, Britain couldn't fight. The gunboats stayed in the harbor. Operation Buccaneer was shelved, so instead of an invasion, Britain launched an economic war. If they couldn't take the oil by force, they would make sure no one else could have it. They organized a total blockade of Iranian oil. The Royal Navy patrolled the Persian Gulf. They announced that any tanker buying Iranian oil would be treated as a buyer of stolen property. They threatened legal action against any company in the world that touched Iranian crude. They froze Iranian assets in British banks. They stopped exporting steel and sugar to Iran. The British engineers at Abadan were ordered to leave. In a scene of immense national drama, the British staff boarded the cruiser HMS Mauritius and sailed away. The refinery, the largest in the world, fell silent. The pipes dried up. The storage tanks were full, but the tap was closed. Britain was trying to strangle Iran into submission. They believed that without oil revenue, the Iranian economy would collapse. The people would starve. They would overthrow Mossadegh and beg the British to return. But Mossadegh refused to break. He told his people they would rather be poor and free than rich and enslaved. He called it an economy without oil. He issued bonds. He asked the people to endure hardship for the sake of sovereignty. And the Iranian people responded. They rallied around him. He became a hero not just in Iran, but across the developing world. He was the man who had stood up to the British Empire. In October 1951, Winston Churchill returned to power as Prime Minister. Churchill was 77 years old. He was a man of the 19th century living in the nuclear age. He had personally converted the Royal Navy from coal to oil back in 1913. He viewed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company not just as a business, but as his child. He saw the loss of Abadan not as a financial dispute, but as a personal insult. Churchill wanted blood. He hated the idea of being bullied by a man in pajamas. He ranted to his cabinet about the need to show strength. He wanted to dust off the invasion plans. He wanted to send the paratroopers. But the economic reality had not changed. The British economy was still on life support. The gold reserves were dwindling. The Americans were still saying no to war. Churchill, the great warrior, realized with a bitter taste that he was the leader of a second-rate power. He could not order the fleet to sail because he couldn't pay for the fuel. Churchill realized he needed a different kind of weapon. If he couldn't use the army, he had to use the shadows. He had to use spies. The British intelligence service MI6 began to plot a coup. They had a network of agents in Iran. Inside the military, the press, the bazaars, they codenamed the Operation Boot. The plan was to use bribery and propaganda to create chaos in Tehran, to turn the people against Mossadegh, to install a pro-British general in his place. But there was a snag. In 1952, Mossadegh discovered the plot. He realized the British embassy in Tehran was a nest of spies. In a bold move, he expelled all British diplomats from Iran. He kicked them out. MI6 lost its eyes and ears on the ground. Their network was headless. They couldn't run a coup from London. They needed someone inside Tehran to hand out the cash. Churchill knew there was only one way back into Iran. He needed the Americans. He needed the CIA. But President Truman was still in the White House. Truman had no interest in overthrowing a democratically elected leader just to save a British oil monopoly. Truman saw Mossadegh as a nationalist, not a communist. He sympathized with Iran's desire to control its own resources. As long as Truman was president, the British were stuck. But time was on Churchill's side. In November 1952, the United States elected a new president, Dwight Eisenhower. And Eisenhower appointed two brothers to key positions of power. John Foster Dulles became Secretary of State. Allen Dulles became director of the CIA. The Dulles brothers were cold warriors. They saw the world in black and white. They saw a global chessboard where every move was a struggle against the Soviet Union. Churchill saw his opening. He knew he couldn't sell a coup to the Americans based on saving British profits. The Americans didn't care about British dividends. In fact, American oil companies were quite happy to see the British monopoly broken. So Churchill changed the narrative. He stopped talking about oil and started talking about communism. He sent his best diplomats and spies to Washington. They spun a terrifying story to the Dulles brothers. They claimed that Mossadegh was weak. They claimed that as the blockade destroyed the Iranian economy, the country was sliding into chaos. They argued that in this chaos, the Tudeh Party, the Iranian Communist Party, would seize power. They painted a nightmare scenario. Iran would fall behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union would gain control of the Persian Gulf. They would control the warm water ports they had sought for centuries. They would control the oil supply of the West. It's not about our money, the British lied. It's about your security. If you don't act now, Tehran will be Moscow by Christmas. It was masterful manipulation. Churchill played on American paranoia. He used the fear of the Red Menace to get the Americans to do the dirty work of the British Empire. Eisenhower and the Dulles brothers bought it. They were terrified of a Soviet Iran. They agreed to a joint operation. The CIA would take the lead. MI6 would provide the intelligence and the contacts. They renamed the plan. Operation Boot became Operation Ajax. The budget was set. $1 million. $1 million to overthrow a government and steal an oil industry worth billions. It was the highest return on investment in the history of espionage. The man chosen to run the operation was Kermit Roosevelt, Jr., grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. He was a romantic figure, a quintessential American spy. In the summer of 1953, he slipped into Iran across the border from Iraq. He carried a fake passport and a suitcase. Inside the suitcase was not a bomb or a radio. It was cash. Stacks of Iranian rials and U.S. dollars. The British had failed to invade with soldiers. They had failed to starve the country with sanctions. Now they were going to try the oldest trick in the book. They were going to buy a revolution. Kermit Roosevelt arrived in a Tehran that was a powder keg. The British blockade had done its work. The economy was collapsing. Inflation was rampant. The middle class was being wiped out. The people who had cheered Mossadegh 2 years earlier were now hungry and anxious. The unity of the nationalist movement was fraying. Roosevelt began by bribing the Iranian press. He handed out thick envelopes of cash to newspaper editors and columnists. Overnight, the Tehran papers began to print vicious attacks on Mossadegh. They called him an atheist, a Jew, a British agent, and a communist spy all at the same time. The contradictions didn't matter. The goal was confusion. Then Roosevelt turned to the streets. He hired gang leaders from the Zircona, the traditional Persian houses of strength. These were musclemen, weightlifters, wrestlers who commanded local respect and fear. For a few $100s, they agreed to organize mobs. Roosevelt hired one mob to shout, "Long live Mossadegh," and smash shop windows. Then he hired another mob to attack the first mob, shouting, "Long live the Shah." The idea was to create total anarchy, to make ordinary citizens terrified of Mossadegh's rule. British agents, still communicating with Roosevelt from the shadows, provided intelligence on which generals could be bought. The coup had a mechanical trigger. It required the Shah of Iran, the young and indecisive monarch, to sign 2 royal decrees. One decree dismissed Mossadegh as prime minister. The other appointed General Fazlallah Zahedi, a Nazi sympathizer and British asset, in his place. The Shah was terrified. He knew Mossadegh was popular. He knew that if the coup failed, he would lose his throne. He hesitated. He packed his bags, ready to flee. To stiffen his spine, the British Broadcasting Corporation played a crucial role. It was the voice of London. In 1953, it was weaponized. The Shah had agreed to sign the decrees only if he received a specific signal confirming British backing. The signal was to be broadcast on the BBC Persian service. Usually at midnight, the announcer would say, "It is now midnight." On the night of the coup, the announcer was instructed to say, "It is now exactly midnight." The Shah heard the extra word. He signed the decrees. On the night of August 15, 1953, the coup was launched. A Shah loyal officer went to arrest Mossadegh, but he had been warned. The Tudeh network had penetrated the military. When the colonel arrived, pro-Mossadegh troops and tanks surrounded him. The arrest failed. The coup collapsed instantly. The Shah fled to Baghdad, then Rome. The CIA panicked. A cable was sent to Roosevelt. Operation failed. Evacuate immediately. Roosevelt ignored the order. He was a gambler. The military coup had failed, but the psychological war was still alive. So he doubled down. This time he wouldn't use soldiers. He would use the street. For 3 days he flooded Tehran with cash, paying mobs, fake communists, and clerics. On August 19, 1953, the city exploded. As the balance of power shifted, neutral army units began defecting to the Shah. Momentum was everything. General Zahedi emerged from a CI, a safe house, riding atop a tank like a symbol of inevitability. The final showdown came at 109 Kak Street, Mohammad Mossadegh's home. What followed was not a coup from the shadows, but a brutal street battle. Pro-Shah tanks smashed through the gates. Mossadegh's guards answered with machine guns and bazookas. For hours, the neighborhood became a war zone. Hundreds died. The house was reduced to rubble. When the ammunition ran out and the roof collapsed, Mossadegh surrendered. He walked from the ruins, an old man in pajamas who had dared to tell the British Empire that Iran was not a gas station. The radio station was seized. A voice announced, "The government of Mossadegh has been crushed. Long live the Shah." In Rome, the Shah received the news over lunch. Pale but relieved, he returned to Tehran in triumph. In London, Winston Churchill celebrated. The gamble had worked. The oil was secure, but victory carried a surprise. The Americans refused to restore Britain's monopoly. The 1954 deal forced Britain to share Iranian oil with U.S. companies. Britain won the coup, but lost its dominance. The American era had begun.